Thrilled that you're here. Today's seminar won't be so much of a traditional research talk, but Jim and I are talking about what sort of format it might be. And it'll be a combination of a presentation of Jim's research over the past 20 years. We'll talk about the work that he's doing currently, as well as how he's led up to that current research. And during that process of talking about his research, he'll also talk about the process of doing research and about sort of what it is like to go through the review process, as well as the substantive findings of the work. And I think that's a particularly useful way in which we've approached a lot of the ELECDEM seminars and a lot of the ELECDEM workshops. And I think, would you be happy if there are questions along the way that you just, I signal somehow that you have a question and you can go ahead and ask that. That's good. We'll keep those. Seem, you can see the Seam will take note of anybody waving their arms at that end, and we'll stop and let you ask questions. And you should all be have the readings that were circulated prior to the talk, and so you know Jim's background, as well as you know that he's published in all the top journals that we all hope to publish in. So he's going to give us the secret of how we do that today, right?
Yeah, the secret is to get dozens of articles rejected
Yes.
and 2 or 3 accepted eventually. Well, listen, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here. Let me start by actually asking a question. I don't know if I can ask this of my Amsterdam friends. I'll start by asking all of you. So how many students do we have here, as opposed to already sort of faculty members?
Just 2 students.
Just 2. And they're, can they hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. How many of you there? Right. How many of you there in Amsterdam are currently students?
PhD students.
Are PhD students? Almost everyone. Okay.
That took a while for them to admit. An identity crisis over
A
there.
while to come to terms with the fact that they're still students, but eventually you will.
We call them we call them researchers.
Okay, researchers. Terrific. Anyway, I asked that question because, as Susan mentioned, one of the things I'm going to do is to talk about my research, but along the way, what I thought I'd do is to offer not just the research, but to a large extent, sort of the background, how I came to do this research, the problems that I ran into in doing this research. Sorry, I'm trying to get myself centered on the screen. Here we go. Now I'm centered. Perfect. And some of the strategies that I used to, in some cases, overcome those problems, both when I was a graduate student and now that I'm a professor. So those of you who are faculty, I ask for a little bit of indulgence. Some of this is clearly not directed at you who already know all about publishing, but I thought for some of the...
we should have actually had some of our colleagues come.
Anyhow,
in light of the discussion from
I'm deciding that a fight has broken out 1 minute into my presentation.
You might want to repeat that comment for the colleagues in Amsterdam who may not have heard that.
Which one, the last?
Yeah, no, the one from Jeff, which prompted that.
Yeah, we haven't heard that.
Jeff, I'll let you repeat it.
No, that's okay. No, we were just having a discussion about these things yesterday at a meeting.
Okay. I'll also offer some observations more directed at the graduate students about some of the challenges I experienced as a graduate student, how in some cases I overcame the challenges, how in other cases the challenges overcame me. And that may at least make you feel a little bit better about some of the challenges that you faced. And I will talk in considerable detail about the process of trying to get this research published, which was and continues to be a very, very significant struggle, and my colleagues who are past the researcher phase, of course, know about that. One final point of introduction, I'm happy to stop at any point and take questions. So I guess they're in Amsterdam. If you can wave your hands if you have a question, and Seam, you can let me know perhaps when people have questions. Okay, let me begin. I should mention that I've been a professor since 1994, so that means this is, goodness, I guess I started my 16th year as being a professor this fall. It only seems like about 60 years. But anyhow, I have been doing this for a long time. And before that, I was a graduate student for 7.5 years. Because unlike in Britain, and I suspect the Netherlands as well, graduate students in America can take an awfully long time to finish their PhDs, particularly when they're in comparative politics, where you're often asked to do field work or face other hurdles that can delay the process. Or if you just are kind of mixed up when you're a graduate student and take a lot of wrong turns, as I did at various points. Anyhow, the central research question that I've grappled with in some way, shape, or form for practically 20 years now, if you include my time in graduate school, is this question right here: how do citizens react when parties shift their policy positions? And the reason I'm interested in this question is first because, of course, it's crucial for political representation. If parties shift their policy positions and citizens either don't even notice they've shifted or don't react at all, then that raises some very troubling questions about mass elite policy linkages. I'm also interested in that question because, as some of you know, for a lot of my career, I've engaged in spatial modeling research. And I'm guessing that most of you graduate students have had a little introduction to that. But anyhow, I'm interested in how voters react to parties' policy positions because this has a great bearing on the strategies that political parties use to try to win votes and to try to win elections. And that's been, frankly, my primary interest for the last 20 years. So I'm interested in both of those. And what I thought I'd do is to sort of take you through the 3 different approaches I've used to trying to answer this question. And as I said, the challenges I faced along the way in trying to be satisfied with my own research and also trying to get it published. So the first approach that I used, listed as approach number 1 here, is described as counterfactual simulations on election survey data from various different countries, including Britain, France, Norway, and the United States. And what I think is the best part of this research was published in a book that I wrote with my frequent collaborators, Sam Merrill and Bernie Grofman, A Unified Theory of Party Competition, that came out a few years ago. And simplifying a little bit what this approach was, essentially, what I was interested in doing was analyzing how voters react when parties shift their policy positions, taking into account what behavioral researchers and students of public opinion and voting behavior have told us about voters, which is the fact that, yes, some voters some of the time care about policy, but many voters at many times care about other things as well. Sometimes they vote based on the state of the economy, and they reward the governing parties if the economy is good, and they punish them if the economy is bad, in a way that's not directly related to the policy positions that the parties have staked out or that the governing parties have implemented. Other voters at different times may be influenced by the personal characteristics of party leaders and the party's elites. Do they appear to be honest? Do they appear to be competent? Is the party unified? Does the party's leader look as if he or she would be someone who would maintain a cool head in a crisis? And note that, again, these characteristics are not directly related to the policy positions that the parties are promoting. Another factor, one that's more controversial, but that some behavioral researchers believe is very important, is a sense of party identification as a long-term effective bond with a political party that may be only tangentially related to the policy positions that the party has currently staked out. And essentially what I tried to do, and with my co-authors here, Sam Merrill and Bernie Grofman, was to ask the question, if we take into account that voters are motivated by many different factors, only one of which has to do with policy, then what kind of projection should we make about how the electorate as a whole, along with individual voters, are likely to react when political parties shift their policy positions? And I won't go into the rather complicated and cumbersome mechanism that we use to give you a very short description, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of this if there's interest in doing so. What my co-authors and I would do is we would take election survey data from, say, the 1992 British general election, was one of the ones we looked at, we would estimate an individual level model of voting behavior in which voters were motivated by their policy distance from the party, but also retrospective evaluations of the economy and the other factors that I described earlier. And then what we would do essentially is to perform a counterfactual simulation in which we would say, okay, we have a basic idea of how voters decide. We know how important or how much weight they attach to issues, but we also know how much weight they attach to all these other factors that are not tied to the party's policy positions. Then we would compute what would happen if, say, all the British voters in 1992, instead of perceiving the Labour Party under Neil Kinnock as being a strongly left-wing party, as indeed the British voters in 1992 did, what if they had perceived the British Labour Party as a more moderate centrist party, as it became subsequently under Tony Blair? Would this have caused enough voters to change their decisions to actually swing the election to Labour? And we performed these counterfactual simulations, and we wrote up the results. Now, in a minute, I'll tell you about how readers and reviewers responded to this, which was definitely not always positive and was frequently strikingly negative. But let me tell you first a couple of things that at least I feel we learned from going through this exercise. The first was the following, that our computations suggested that if parties shifted their position within limits, that is, if the Labour Party didn't become a bunch of communists, if the Conservative Party didn't become a bunch of Nazis, for example. We didn't look at that. But as long as the parties engaged in what seemed like reasonable or plausible policy shifts, the effects of parties changing their position on their expected vote share was surprisingly modest. And one of the main reasons for this is, of course, that we computed, consistent with most behavioral research, that voters are motivated by so many other things besides the party's policy positions that don't necessarily change if the party shift their positions. So one of our conclusions was that, contra what spatial modelers of the sort of classic Anthony Downsian variety would have us believe, if political parties shift their positions, you're not necessarily going to see an electoral earthquake in response from the electorate. The second thing that I felt, and this is one of the main arguments that Sam Merrill, Bernie Grofman, and I really pushed, was that we thought we gained some insights into why political parties like Labour under Neil Kinnock, the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher, the Republican Party in America under Ronald Reagan, and so on, why these parties announced strikingly non-centrist positions. And to sort of simplify or to telescope what's a rather complicated argument, our computations suggested the following. That if, say, the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan had shifted more towards the center, a spatial model would say, oh, that'll be wonderful. There are all these centrist voters. They'll all switch and vote for the Republican Party. Our computations, however, suggested that, first of all, a lot of voters in the center weren't really evaluating the parties or the American candidates based on policy to begin with. And so their decisions weren't going to change if the Democrats or Republicans moved toward the center. Furthermore, many of the party's long-term partisans, strong Republican partisans or strong Democratic partisans, cared a great deal about policy. And they also tended to hold strikingly non-centrist positions. Long-term Republican stalwarts, of course, tended to hold very conservative positions. Long-term Democratic supporters, quite liberal positions. They pay attention to policy. And if, say, the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan had moved to the center, those long-term Republican stalwarts wouldn't react by switching to supporting the Democrats. What they would do was sit out the election and not vote. And this suggests, therefore, that if a party that announces strongly non-centrist positions, like the Reagan Republican Party, the Conservative Party under Thatcher, and so on, moderates its positions, it risks a situation where its long-term supporters are demobilized, and they tend to be on the wings, and centrist voters don't really change their behavior. So some people agreed with this argument, some people didn't. I at least felt I had perhaps gained some intuition about this long-term puzzle from the perspective of people who adopt the Anthony Downsian spatial modeling approach. That is, why is it that all of these big parties all over the world that take strongly left-wing or right-wing positions don't go to the center to get more votes? Our computations suggested that if you take into account how voters actually behave, that then it suggests that A, shifting positions won't necessarily have a big effect. To the extent it does, going to the center may actually hurt you. Okay, what I've talked about, and as I said, this came out of a book, and we published, Sam Merrill and I primarily, roughly a dozen articles leading up to this book. Well, this story so far perhaps sounds like a story of smooth, uninterrupted progression. We came out with this theory, we liked our results, we published it, and everybody lived happily ever after. That was not the way it worked in practice. And for the graduate students there, or researchers, excuse me, in Amsterdam and here, let me talk a little bit about the problems that I experienced as I worked on this research and as I tried to get it published. I'll start with the problems I experienced in working on this research in graduate school, and a lot of this will be the story, listen to what I did and then do the exact opposite, and you will probably come out of it very well. When I first started working on these ideas, and a lot of these were in my doctoral dissertation, I worked on them by myself. And I was married already at the time, and my wife would often say to me, well, Jim, are you sure these ideas are any good? You should really talk to the faculty at the University of Michigan, where I was a graduate student, and get their reactions. My reaction was always to say, no, I'm not ready yet. I have to read 8 more books and 27 more articles, because if I talk to the faculty now, I'll look foolish and ignorant and uninformed, and I'll be very, very embarrassed. And so I put off talking to the faculty, and I should mention now that I've been a professor for a long time, I see many other graduate students do the same thing. Graduate students tend to be bashful, and their most sort of terrifying thought is that they'll make a bad impression on the faculty if they go in when they're not perfectly prepared. So just a quick note for those of you in Amsterdam and the graduate students here, let me tell you now, being on the other side of the desk and talking to graduate students, we don't expect you to be prepared. That's why you're not professors yet. You're still students. We don't expect you to know everything. And I don't think I've ever talked to a graduate student, even one who came in and obviously didn't know a lot of the background of their research agenda, and come away really thinking poorly of the student. Because I always encourage students, talk to the faculty as quickly as possible. If I had talked to my faculty members, I could have saved myself so much time. I wound up reading literally dozens, perhaps hundreds of articles that turned out to be irrelevant. I plowed my way through dozens of very long, turgid, and boring books that turned out to be irrelevant. If I listened to my professors, which would have involved me actually talking to them, which I didn't do, they could have said, no, you don't need to read that, and that. Just read these 2 articles in this one book, and that's the best, most recent research. So I would strongly advise you, I know as graduate students, researchers, I know how hard it can be to screw up your courage and actually go into a faculty member's office, look them in the eye and say, here's what I want to do. Help. But that's what we're here for, to help you with these projects. I could have saved myself at least a year in graduate school if I hadn't decided that I was not ready, and probably would never be ready, to talk to the faculty, because I absolutely didn't know enough. Something else that I didn't do in graduate school, and that I even didn't do for the first few months I was a professor, for largely the same reason, was I never took pieces of my dissertation that were articles and submitted them to journals, because I was convinced they weren't good enough. And it was always the same thing. My wife would say, send it out, just send it out. I go, no, I have to polish it. I have to write 3 more appendices, and I have to do supplementary analyses, and I need 37 more footnotes to deal with every possible objection that any possible reviewer might have. Let me offer an opinion which may not apply to every single person in Amsterdam or in this room, but I'm guessing it applies to most of them, which is that your research is better than you realize. And I'm guessing that many, perhaps most of you there in Amsterdam or here, have research which is already publishable. Now, why is it that I'm guessing many of you don't believe what I just said and think, oh no, my research isn't good enough? Well, what is it that you do when you're a researcher, or graduate student, and you're reading and preparing for your project, or what you did as an undergraduate? You read the very best research by the very best professors. And it's easy to think that that is the standard required for publication. Well, think of this as if you were deciding if you wanted to be a professional footballer. All they did is when you were trying to evaluate this, they showed you clip after clip of David Beckham, the pre-Posh Spice David Beckham, who is a terrific footballer, and you watch David Beckham bending penalty kick after penalty kick into the goal. And then someone said, okay, so do you think you can play professional football? Your answer would likely be no. You can't be as good as David Beckham. But you know what? That's not the standard to publish research, just like that's not the standard to have a successful professional career in football. David Beckham is not a typical football player. Anthony Downs or Bob Erickson or some of these other researchers are not typical professors. And the research of theirs that you're reading is the very best of their research. Well, I realize that now, but I didn't realize it at the time. And I looked at my own research, and I decided quite accurately, you know what? What I'm doing isn't as good as Anthony Downs or Manker Olson or Bob Erickson. Therefore, it's hopeless for me to submit it to a journal. That, in retrospect, was a mistake. And I'll just throw that out there. If some of you are thinking about publishing, your own research may be considerably better and considerably more valuable for publication than you actually realize. Well, let me go on and talk a little bit about what happened when I did start submitting my articles. What I say next may sort of contradict what I just said before about how, of course, it's publishing. So finally, when I was a professor, I started to submit my articles because I sort of knew I had to, because I wouldn't be a professor for long if I didn't publish enough articles. And for literally the first 2 years I was a professor, during that time I probably submitted, 4 or 5 different articles, but there were about 8 or 10 submissions, for reasons I'll describe in just a moment. Every single article that I submitted was rejected. And they weren't simply rejected, but they were really eviscerated by the critics. And I'm not saying that due to false modesty. A lot of the critics, or my tormentors, as I like to think of them, it wasn't that they thought my research was boring or not quite good enough. They really hated it. And let me talk, I'm proud to say, and I'll explain briefly why and then sort of what I did. I mentioned before, I've talked about Anthony Downs and this spatial modeling approach. The way that I framed my research, that I sort of skipped in this discussion just to sort of keep things relatively brief, was what I argued was that the types of spatial modelers that Anthony Downs or subsequent spatial modelers worked on, these spatial models would be better if we dropped the assumption that voters vote entirely based on parties' and candidates' policy positions. And if we build in the assumption that voters care about policy, but they also care about things like the economy and competence and integrity and so on. Well, when I first wrote up these articles, I would begin by citing spatial modelers, and then I'd say, and I'm going to, I didn't try to be too arrogant, but I'd say I would like to extend these models. That was the phrase I used. By building in an assumption that voters care about other things besides only policy. They care about policy, but they care about other things as well. Well, the editors, seeing my articles and seeing that I began by citing a bunch of spatial modelers and talking about their work, sent my articles to spatial modelers. And spatial modelers, it's not really exaggerating much, a lot of them really hated what I was doing. And the reason they hated it was because they felt that spatial modeling is a rational choice approach. And when I built in things like voters having long-term party identification that wasn't tied to the party's policy positions, their response was, that's irrational. That's an irrational motivation. Or that voters might like a candidate because he or she was a good campaigner. That's irrational. That has no place in a spatial model. To give you a verbatim quote from one of my reviews, and I can do this because some of these reviews have been tattooed into my brain for a long time. One of the very first reviews I got began with the sentence, "First of all, I was deeply offended by this paper." It went on to say, the author claims that he has a theory. What he has is about as far from a theory as possible. Instead, it is a disgraceful mishmash of off-the-top-of-the-head observations along with post-hoc rationalizations. It went on, and the last sentence said something like, the lack of clarity of thought, intellectual rigor, or intellectual honesty in this paper is horrifying. And those aren't the exact words. So that gave me a warm and fuzzy feeling when I got that particular thing. And so, again, this is more for the graduate students than for the faculty members here. So the question was, what am I going to do? That was my research agenda. I was already a professor, and I didn't really have time to retool and become an expert in, I don't know, Irish politics or the study of South American agricultural patterns or something. I had my agenda, and I had to stick with it. So I had to do something to get it published. So what I decided, and what I realized from reading the reviews, was the people who really hated the research tended to be formal theorists and spatial modelers. The very small subset of people who evinced at least some interest and appreciation for some of the work were obviously people who specialized in public opinion and voting behavior. The spatial modelers, this is awful. We built irrational things into a rational choice model, and we're just not having it. The students of public opinion and voting behavior, on the other hand, tend to say, oh, how nice that someone who does formal modeling is finally paying attention to our results. So what I did was, I didn't change my arguments, I didn't change my results, I didn't change the way I went about it. What I did was rewrite the first page and the abstract of every paper I wrote to cite about 27 behavioral researchers before I even mentioned the word spatial modeling. I would go so far as in the abstract, in the very first sentence, I would say something like, building on the insights from the book, The American Voter, I do the following. Well, what I assumed, and I don't know if any of you here have had experience being editors, but I assume editors are busy people. They don't have the time to read every submission through before sending out to reviewers. They probably just skim the abstract in the first page and say, okay, the author cites this person, and this person. I'll send it to this, that, and the other person. Well, what began happening fairly quickly was my reviews started to get a lot more positive, and they were clearly being written by empirical researchers interested in public opinion and voting behavior, and very few of them were written by spatial modelers. The spatial modelers continued to, many of them anyway, really hate what I was doing. But they tended to be outnumbered starting about year 2 or year 3 when I sort of learned this trick. And notice the trick. I didn't change my research. I just changed the cues that I was sending to the editor. I started to get many more positive reviews. And all these articles that had been just incinerated by the formal theorists were actually getting accepted and getting published. So I don't know exactly what to take from that, except what I often tell graduate students is, especially if they get a paper rejected, what I usually say is, it's not that the paper isn't publishable, it's that you haven't found the audience for it yet. And in my case, clearly the audience for my research was empirically oriented researchers, not these formal theorists. And that applies to a lot of different papers. I'll talk about this more later, and I talked with Seem and Maria yesterday. And in many cases, the kind of research that many of you are doing in Amsterdam, and some of you here too, you can sell it in several different ways. This is a story about female candidates. Or this is a story